Hi, and welcome back to the Big Grief Podcast. I'm Alison, and in today's episode, I am talking with my friend, Heather Golczynski. Heather is the widow of a friend of mine, Marc Golczynski. Marc was a Marine, and he unfortunately passed away in Fallujah, Iraq in March of 2007. So it's been 18 years since Marc passed away. Heather talks a lot about her journey with grief, losing Marc, and then also a few years after losing Marc, losing her only brother. So it's a very emotional and interesting conversation. And I hope that it's beneficial to someone out there. This conversation will probably be at least a couple of episodes. So I hope that everyone out there continues to watch and share and like and subscribe. We really appreciate all the love that's been shown to us over these first few episodes. And Dave does not appear in this episode or the next one, but he will be back with us soon. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. And let's discuss our big grief with Heather Golczynski. I think I said that to you a few years ago. I wanted to talk to you for a while. But yeah, thank you so much for just.
Of course.
And that's all this is it's just a conversation. That's kind of what Dave and I do is we just sit down and it's conversations we would have anyway. And we just sit down and talk.
I mean, I didn't do anything to prepare for this, if I'm being honest. I thought, well, I'm just going to roll in here and tell you what it's been like.
I wrote down some questions for you. And then the more I got to thinking about Marc, the more I would have to stop because I would start to tear up. And I was like, maybe it's best if I just sort of, like you say, if I just kind of roll with it. So, but anyway, for anybody who might not be familiar with who you are, sort of introduce yourself and just, talk about yourself and Marc and your story.
Okay. So my name is Heather Golczynski. I am the former wife of Marc Golczynski. He was a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. Marc and I have a child together, Christian. And let's see, we met way, way back. It seems like 100 years ago. Marc deployed his first time in 2004, and he did 10 months overseas in Iraq, in Fallujah, Iraq. And that was an interesting time, during the war, during our lives, all of that kind of stuff. But Marc, he came home, and then 2001 rolled around, and in the spring, he was about to get out of the Marine Corps. And we were kind of starting to transition to normal life until 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, Marc re-upped with the Marine Corps, which anybody that knew Marc knew that was pretty, standard for something that he would do, right? And then in 2006, they had asked Marc's unit if some of the guys who had some background on Iraq and who had been to Iraq before, if they wanted to deploy with a unit out of Michigan that was made up of, some younger guys. They were looking for a little bit of experience to kind of fill in the gaps where they needed. So Marc volunteered to go back a second time. He left in August of 2006. Christian was 8 at the time. We were living up here in Maryland. My parents were here. So we lived up here. And then in 2007, in March of 2007, Marc was killed in Iraq. And that's kind of where my real friendship with grief became apparent. That part was really, really hard. Marc was my everything. And I think that people don't necessarily take into account the fact that Marc and I had Christian very young. So we were babies raising a baby, but we had done a lot of life in our little bit together. When our other friends were out in the clubs or out doing other things, we were raising a child and trying to make things work and trying to be an adult in a kid body, So there was a lot of, he was my very best friend outside of anything else that Marc and I have ever been. He was my person. He was my very best friend. He was the first one I called, good, bad, indifferent, ugly, gross, like whatever it was, he was my person. I was sitting in accounting. I was taking an accounting 2 class at night. I had gone to school early, like I always do, because you have like a 10-minute window with traffic, right? So I would always leave early. So I got there a little bit early and I would write Marc. And we were far enough in the journey that he was about to be home. So I knew this would be one of the last letters I mailed because it took so long to get over there. They were due to come home the end of April. And it was the end of March. So I'd written my letter. I was getting ready. Class had just started. And a gentleman came to the door and he said, I'm looking for Heather, and then like stumbled on my last name because, a lot of people won't try to say goals in with letters, right? So I immediately, I was like, that's me. And so he said, I need you to come with me. So I was like, oh, okay. So I got up and left everything on my desk. And he said, no. I need you to get everything that you have and come with me. So I said, okay, and I'm thinking, gosh, like, did somebody hit my car? Like, is something, like what could happen at school?
Right.
They called out of class as adults, right?
Yeah.
So I go with him and I'm like, hey, like, what's going on? And he's like, I really can't tell you anything. I was just told to come get you and bring you here. So I said, okay. So I rode with him to an admin office and he took me inside this office and he pushed me towards the back. And so when he pushed the door open, my father was sitting there. And so I was like, is my mom okay? Right. Like, what happened to mom? So I looked at my dad and when I walked into the room, I noticed that there were two uniformed men, one a Marine, one a chaplain to my right. So you kind of turn. So my dad's on my left. And so they started reading me the whole spiel that you get and all these things. And my head was just, 90 to nothing, just whirling. Like, what how am I going to do this? How am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to get my kid to college? How, like, this isn't Marc. This is not my Marc. Like, I don't know what's happening here, 90 to nothing. So
there's been a mistake.
Yeah. Cause it's not happening to me.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, no way.
Yep.
And so my dad drove me home. They wouldn't let me drive home, which was probably smart, but I was a little bit angry. I was like, it's a mistake. So I can drive my own self home, like, we're just going to have to come back out here and get my car. So, but my dad drove me home. And we went home. And so I stopped everybody. They said, Christian is next of kin. So we need to tell Christian. So I stopped everybody on the driveway and I said, you guys may come inside. You may be in the room when I tell Christian, but nobody will tell Christian except for me. And so we went inside and I sat Christian on the couch and I told him what happened. And then my whole entire world just kind of fell apart in an infinite number of pieces. And then it gets very blurry from there, So at that time, my mother-in-law, Marc's mom and stepdad didn't know yet. Marc's brother knew, but, he was on his way there and he wasn't talking to anybody. It was very, very hard. And we were, of course, in Maryland and they were in Tennessee. So then there was the distance too, right? Like, you can't get to somebody, hug somebody, do what you feel like you need to do. So there was that part of it too. So then let's see, we went home for the funeral, of course. And at the funeral the funeral, first of all, was not a normal funeral.
No, it wasn't. I was there. It was massive.
It was huge. Yeah. So the church was standing room only. There were people out on the lawn, people outside, all that kind of stuff. I had chosen to speak at Marc's funeral. I told him I would if anything ever happened because nothing was ever going to happen. I was never going to have to do that, but I did. And then, it was just, we just kind of went through the motions. And then when we drove from the church to the cemetery, the roads were lined with people. They were lined with people with flags, people that pulled over, restaurants, the fire truck with the flag.
The highway was blocked.
Yes.
Highway 64, because my brother actually drove me and we didn't even actually park. We stopped in the road because you could not park anywhere.
Like there were like 4 cars deep along.
Yeah, there was so much traffic. It was, I'd never seen anything like it. And I haven't since. I've never.
Even then, when we went to the cemetery, they drove us, of course, we had like a Hummer for the family, which was really cool, But when we went, like, we waited because there were so many people still coming. And so we had like people that stood around the outside with flags because this was a time when people would protest and do all that kind of stuff and they didn't want you to. So we had people with flags that lined the outside of the cemetery. And I remember sitting in front of the casket and just looking backwards. It was just a sea of people, like a sea of people. And you're like, in that moment, your vision becomes very narrow. You know, I was worried about my child and that's really it, honestly, just my child. You know, my mom and dad were behind me, and so I knew they were right there, and Bob and Elaine were right next to me. So but then yeah, so during the funeral, you know, there's a picture snapped of Christian accepting the flag, right? And so we had seen the photographers in front of us, like that kind of thing. I never in a million years would have gathered that that picture would come out of the funeral. I think it's a stunning picture.
It's a pretty famous picture. And I was actually standing behind that photographer when he took that picture.
Yeah.
Because I had my camera and I just kind of, and I don't know if you know this, I recorded the whole thing.
No,
And
I did not know that.
It's on an external hard drive of mine, and I have not watched it in the last 18 years. It's still there. But it was just a thing, and I just hit record and I just held it up. I mean,
Yeah.
that it's, you know, so I got all of that. But yeah, I was standing right behind that photographer when he took that picture, that angle of Christian receiving the flag. And it was to watch a Marine get choked up
Yeah.
doing that.
One of the hardest things I have ever done is stand in front of a Marine and watch a tear roll down their face without permission. It destroyed me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was unbelievable. Yeah.
So that happened. And not knowing that at the time, that plunged us into grieving in the public eye.
Yeah.
Because that picture, you know, one of my friends texted me and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm, you know, just heading back to Elaine's." And she said, "You need to stop and get a newspaper." And I was like, okay, you know, like, what do I need? I was angry at that point too, you know, like I'm just trying to get through day to day. There's still stuff that needs to happen. I'm still trying to take care of 74 people. And, you know, so I said, okay. And so I stopped and got it. And it was right on the front of a section of the paper. And I was just like, holy, like, yeah.
So you did not know, none of the family knew that the press, you know, anybody was going to be there at the funeral. You didn't know that that was happening.
No, but it's a public event, right? Like, it's
True.
not like they needed to ask permission or do anything like that, you know? And I mean, I've never really been to a funeral not like that, not for a military funeral. So I had no idea what was supposed to be there or not supposed to be there, you know, whatever. So it just seemed like that's what happened. I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know that picture was captured, obviously. And so then everybody in and around town wanted to talk to us, right? Then it was, "Hey, can we come over and talk? How do you feel? What's happening?" You know, all that stuff. "And can we talk to Christian?" And I'm like, "Absolutely not," you know?
Yeah.
So we did field a lot of those kind of interviews and that kind of stuff. But then when it went viral, then that opened up a whole different thing because at this point, I have to go back home at some point. Cause like I said, we're in Maryland. I have a job, you know, Christian's in school. Um, and at that point, everything was so blurry to me. For like 9 months to a year after Marc's funeral, I only remembered like bits and pieces here and there, you know, maybe something that really touched me. Like I definitely remember that, or something that I found funny that happened. Like, you know, if you've spent any time around Marines, you know that they have like a very dark sense of humor in the most horrible times. And so there were things that happened that were funny that I knew Marc would think was funny, but you know, like you couldn't laugh in that moment. You know what I mean? Like you felt bad for laughing too. So I remember those kinds of things. And I remember like almost like Instagram reels, right? Like 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. That first year we were back and forth pretty much like once a month. We would fly to Tennessee and there would be something else, a bust unveiling or some event where they were going to read his name or, you know, adding him to the baseball field in Lewisburg or any of the things. So we were back and forth like every month. So it was just a whirlwind at that time. Like, I don't know how my kids stayed in school and stayed focused. It was crazy.
Did it feel real for you then, I mean, when did it start to feel real to you?
I think the hardest part was that he had been deployed for so many months prior, so it was very easy to be like, he's just deployed.
Oh,
You know?
he's still just he's
Right.
still just overseas,
Yeah,
right?
we didn't have like Facebook was just becoming a thing. You know what I mean? Like we could
I
get on
communicated with him. Yeah, MySpace. That's
your
how I
MySpace.
communicated with him.
So there wasn't until like we didn't really like video chat a whole lot. Like, there it was just like I carried my cell phone around because I never knew when he was going to call because of the time difference. So I got very used to having my phone and never leaving with my phone. And I'm still kind of like that, honestly. But it wasn't real because I could just say he's just deployed. So when the guys all came home from Iraq a month later, I went home and I went to the homecoming. And when you see everybody come back and then you leave in your car by yourself, like it, that was that was a moment for me that I was like, well, damn, and then I just I very neatly packed up all my emotions about it, shoved it in a little box and pushed it as far down as I could get it. And I was listening to the podcast and you had said, like your mom said, take care of the house, right? My kind of thing was take care of our kid. You know what I mean? Like take care of my family, take care of Christian. Like it was
Right.
such a monumental, like I would have done it anyways. You know what I mean? But now I'm like, oh my God, I can't let him down. And then there was the whole, like, I need to make sure that I do right by his memory or make sure his legacy is still alive. I don't want people to forget about him. I don't want all the things. And then doing it in the public eye. Like, then there was people that wanted to reach out or send you something. We got cards and letters and teddy bears and blankets and poems and all of these things. And I felt like a charity case and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. Looking back, right, I needed all of that. I needed every single bit of it and had no idea in that moment. So, like, especially when other people go through the same thing, I'm like, look, it's going to feel like this. Don't let it. People are gonna help you before you even know you need help,
Right.
and you, like, accept it because there's gonna be a time in the not distant future where people aren't offering help anymore, and you're gonna need it, and they're gonna be moved on. So, take it while you can get it, and don't look at it as charity, look at it as something to get you over the hump to the next part.
Right.
So, that part became very real for me, and then every time we went back home, we would see Marc's brother and his family. We would see Marc's mom and stepdad and like the family, but Marc was never there. So we started hanging out a lot with the guys too, with the Marines and stuff, like when we were home. And it was great to be around them. But the second everybody leaves, like you go back to that space where you're like, okay, now what? And I think too, like, I didn't ever dream about Marc. It took me a couple years actually to finally like dream about Marc. And then I never dreamed of him like where I could see his face. Like I only dreamed of him where I knew he was in the room to the side or like I was calling him, but he wouldn't answer the phone.
Really?
Or things like that. I still to this day, I've only dreamed of his face. I can count maybe 3 dreams that I've ever had where I could see his face, but I'm aware that he's around.
Yeah.
And it was a crazy time. And, I had Christian to raise and I'm an oldest child. I am a Cancer. Like family is everything to me. I'm a caretaker. I need everybody to be okay, even if that means that I have to sacrifice myself to get it done. And I do that all the time, but everybody has to be okay. So during that time, especially, that's what I did. I packed up all my emotions, like I said, put them in a little box, tied a little bow, shoved it way down. And then I moved on with life, and I did everything. I was everything. I portrayed that I was good to go to everybody. And then at nighttime, when I would lay in the dark by myself or in the shower was the worst part for me. I would sit in the floor of the shower and cry until the water turned cold, or I would cry so hard that I'd have to lean over and throw up and outside the shower.
Mhm.
I hated it. I was exhausted, like physically, but also just like on a soul level. I was just exhausted trying to be okay. And that took me a lot of time to kind of start working through that stuff, about 4 years actually before I started kind of working through some stuff on my own.
Yeah.
And then that becomes interesting because 5 years after Marc died, my brother was killed in a car accident. And he's my only sibling. He's my younger brother. And his daughter was staying in the summer with me at my house. So we woke up that morning and my phone was ringing and I couldn't get to my cell phone fast enough. And then my house phone was ringing and it was just like crazy. So I finally answer the phone. My dad's on the phone and then there's people knocking on my door. It's like 6:30 in the morning. So I'm trying to hear my dad, but the dogs are barking. So I open the front door and it's some family friends of ours who have come because they know my dad called him and said, "Hey, we have to tell Heather this, go over there." Christian came down the stairs because he heard me yelling at the phone, like, at my dad. Like, "What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, what's happening?" And Christian didn't know what was going on, and then he heard other voices, so he thought we were, like, getting robbed or something, so he's standing at the top of the stairs, like, trying to figure out what's going on. So he comes down, so I have to sit him down in my living room, tell him, like, "Hey, Jason was killed in a car accident." And then he went upstairs to get my niece who was staying here, and I had to sit Anna down and tell Anna the same way that I had to 5 years prior, sit down Christian and tell Christian. And all of the things that were so parallel absolutely destroyed anything I had left. And so you had said too that you categorize things by dates, right? By times and things like that. That's how it makes sense to you. So I'm a math person. So I do numbers and patterns and that kind of thing, right? And so my brother, Marc was 30 when he died. My brother was 31. Jason was killed on the 20th. Marc was killed on the 27th. Jason was killed on the 28th. Like Christian was 8, Anna was 9. Like they're separated by ones, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So anyways, I know, crazy, but I do things like that all the time.
Yeah.
So, but then, at that point I knew like there is just not a place far enough down to shove this kind of hurt. And everything that I had not dealt with Marc bubbled right back to the surface. And I literally could not breathe. I felt like I was being strangled. I felt like I was a failure. I felt like, you did this before, why can't you do it again? Like all of the things. And then I have to make sure that my kid's okay again, or that my mom and dad are okay, or, like all of my people are okay. Never
You switch back into caretaker mode.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was the first time that I went and got grief counseling about a year after my brother died. I got into a point where I knew I could not get over the hump by myself. And so I went and got help. Saw a grief counselor for like a year and a half. Absolutely adored her. Worked through a lot of things. Not quite as much as I wanted to. She got a job somewhere else and wound up leaving. And I didn't want to switch counselors because I still struggle with this like today. It's so hard to go in and go, okay, I need a good session or two just to tell you like the skeleton of my bag. Like, here's how it went. Here are the things that happened, and not just the grief, right? Because you still have life. Like you still have promotions you didn't get, or things that, car trouble when you just spent all the money on something else, or whatever, all the things that life throws at you too. And on top of that, I'm raising a kid. So I'm in the stands at football or lacrosse, or I'm at teacher meetings and back to school nights and making sure he gets his homework done. And, where's he going to go to high school? He wanted to go to private high school. So that was a whole thing. And like life just happens too, right? And now I'm like, okay, my niece, like now I need to also play a bigger role in my niece's life to make up for the gap that she'll miss with her dad, right? Because that's what Jason would want from me. And so I became all of these things that everybody else needed to me to be for them. And in the process, absolutely lost myself, and then, like you go through life and you try to do whatever. My whole motto is you do whatever makes your heart happy, right? So I may do some things that people are like, what in the world? Why is she doing that? but it works for me. After Marc died, we started adopting families that had also had a loved one killed. And we would send them presents and just reach out and be like, hey, just wanted to send you a smile, like we're in the same shoes you are, because Christian had a really hard time with being the only one that lost his dad that way, like he didn't know anybody else that had lost a military father in like, like people had lost their dad or like they weren't around in their lives, but it wasn't like his. He was the only one. And because we were in the public eye too, right? We were splashed on, Good Morning America and every social media and newspaper and magazine and this and that and that. So he just felt different. So we started reaching out to other families that had kids so that he would know he wasn't different. So that's how that all actually started. And then after a while, that wasn't giving me the same joy. So I started reaching out to families who had lost military members by suicide because they don't get the same benefits and the same support and the same things that we get. And so then that became my focus, right? Because I wanted to be able to help people that needed the help more than we did, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then when that started to feel more like a chore than something that made me feel good, then I started giving for animals, for rescues, for those who were voiceless and that kind of stuff. And then that became my thing for a while. But it was literally whatever made me feel good at that time. And then about a year after Marc died, it was almost the 1-year anniversary, I think. And the Marine Corps had called me and asked me, hey, we're having a gathering. Would you like to come be the guest speaker? Tell your story. So I was like, yeah, sure. So we went to St. Louis and I did. They raised a lot of money and that felt good. So then word kind of got out that I would, like walk through the details of how we found out and challenges we had and that kind of stuff. And so then I started speaking about our story here, there, and everywhere. And then I started working with foundations. And the foundations, like one of my favorite ones is the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation. And they raise money for children of Marines, not just the fallen, but just any child of Marines. And it's for education. And they help Christian out through college. And they were just fantastic people.
Wow.
And so I started speaking for them in different locations. Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation, that they supported Marine Corps and law enforcement, first responders, that kind of stuff. Same thing. It supported the kids, right? They also helped us out a lot. So I started speaking for these foundations to help raise money for other people that were in similar situations. And that made me feel good. So I literally have just done whatever I needed to do to get by. But I think then too, after my brother died, it was almost a comparison, right? Like, am I grieving enough for Jason or just for Marc? Or, okay, Jason wasn't public and Marc was public and he had like it was very easy to support a cause where my brother didn't have that same cause. So I'm like, okay, well, I need to figure out like how to do something equally for my brother that I did for Marc. And so that was really tough on me for a long time because I couldn't figure out how to make it equal. Not that it ever needed.
I did the same with my parents. Yeah.
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 So you're like, oh, okay. So that was a struggle, I think. And then I think too, we started gathering at the cemetery. And so like even the first year that Marc died, some of his Marines were going to go out there and we weren't going to go, and then 3 days before I just felt like I needed to go too. So we booked flights and went home and we have now gathered at the cemetery every single year. It'll happen later this month. It'll be the 18th year that we have all gathered at the cemetery. And that's very phenomenal too. And I didn't realize how much that was for me as much as it was for the guys until COVID happened and we couldn't gather. So we got on a Zoom meeting just like this and we still took our Bushmill shot in Marc's honor. We still talked and did all the things that we had to do. We just did it on Zoom because you just have to, it's just tradition, right? Like you just have to do that. So that helped a lot too, but you still are who you are and deal with what you deal with when you go home or you lay in the dark at night and it's just you in the darkness. And there's so much too that you have to that you don't plan for. The hard days, I can look at a calendar and know that's going to be a hard day, but it's the random Tuesdays or the song or the smell or a food or just somebody giggles the same way, or even Christian, like he'll send me a picture sometimes and I'm like, Jesus, he looks just like his dad. Just certain things just trigger you. It can be easy enough and be like, oh, that's a good memory. Or it can take you out. You know what I mean? Like it just paralyzes me sometimes still.
Yeah.
And I think that part, I don't know, that part's really hard. The unexpected things and how you're going to deal with that. I think that becomes hard. And I feel like, during my journey with grief, I feel like I was kind of plucked from this life and put on a different little place, right? And you
Mhm.
get taught all these lessons and shown all these things. And, then they pick you back up and they put you in this life again. And I have always been a very empathetic person, but I am almost overly empathetic. I cry more than I've ever cried in my entire life. Doesn't have to be anything sad. National anthem will get me. Bagpipes will get me. Four-chair turn on the voice, that'll get me. Um, Happy ending, you know what I mean? Like, that'll get me. And I think too that people don't realize, while all the hardships, we've had really good memories along the way too. And every one of those good memories, good milestones, all of the things, they always have an undertone of grief. Like Christian graduated high school, graduated college, got a job, did all these things. And so I grieved, like, for our changing relationship, because that was, once I didn't have him to take care of, it was very hard for me to figure out, who the hell am I? And what do I want? What do I need? What is my purpose now that I'm not needed full time as a mom, right? But also you grieve for Marc because Marc's not here to see his son do these things, or you grieve for my brother because my brother's not here to see those things, or he's not there to see it with Anna, with my niece. It's the grief for all the other things too, the other people, the lives that, won't be shared and the things that won't get done. And I don't know, I think that part sometimes is also just as overwhelming, I guess, as the actual grief itself.